This morning, Senator Milne, thanks very much for joining us. What do you make of Tony Abbott's foray into the world stage over the past week or so? Would you rate it as a success? He appears to have had a particularly, I guess, fruitful conversation with the US President. He was also well received by the Canadian Prime Minister as well.
Well, certainly here in Australia, people are looking at his performance overseas, but more particularly, it's being seen as a climate denial recruitment tour. That's why he felt so comfortable in Canada, because he and Stephen Harper clearly intend to get together to try and undermine achieving a global treaty in 2015. That's a huge disappointment to those of us in Australia who worked to put together our really world-leading clean energy package. Clearly, President Obama didn't wish to embarrass our Prime Minister in their discussions over climate change, but it should be on the agenda for the G20, and the fact that Australia is rejecting that demonstrates to investors around the world that Tony Abbott, when he says Australia's open for business, he's only talking about dig it up, cut it down, ship it away business. He's not talking about decarbonising the economy type business.
Okay, let's talk about the G20 then. Of course, we've already had meetings in Sydney and there are some in Cairns before the final big meeting in Brisbane later this year. In terms of climate change, what are you hoping will be on the agenda, and what are you hoping will come out of those discussions between world leaders?
Well, I was hoping that climate would clearly be front and centre at the G20. After all, if we're to achieve a 2015 treaty, we're going to need an agreement on climate finance. This has been one of the main sticking points in previous negotiations, and so you need these finance ministers to actually get together and talk about how they are going to finance it. That's clearly not going to happen if Tony Abbott has his way. Also, issues around fossil fuel subsidies, that's been something that President Obama previously wanted to end. Tony Abbott is very keen on them. So I hope that the Americans and the Europeans keep putting pressure on the Australian government to make climate central to the G20 meeting, but that remains to be seen. If it doesn't go on the agenda, I think it undermines the credibility of the G20. After all, you've got Ban Ki-moon's summit in September, leading into the Lima talks, going into the negotiations in Paris in 2015. If the G20 doesn't deal with it, then the G20 will be seen to have shirked the climate emergency facing the planet.
Okay, Susan has a question for you.
Hi, Christine. I want to talk about domestic Australian politics with you and this the controversial carbon tax policy. So yes, Tony Abbott plans to repeal it, but then he has other ways of incentivizing households and businesses to cut back on their CO2 emissions. For instance, he's going to provide taxpayer-funded incentives for polluters to reduce their emissions. I mean, isn't that a kind of a smarter way to do it, given how unpopular the carbon tax policy has been in Australia itself?
No, it's not a smarter way to do it. Australia has priced its greenhouse gas emissions. We've brought in a package which includes a massive rollout of renewable energy. We've started to bring down significantly our emissions in the electricity sector, and what Tony Abbott's put on the table is a joke. It's nothing like what President Obama has just proposed, because in the United States there will be a cap on emissions from power stations, and states will be able to engage in carbon pricing and trading across them. But in Australia, what we're having is actually taxing the rest of the population to pay the polluters, and now we discover today that almost all of that money is going to go into tree planting schemes. It is a joke. The wheels have fallen off Tony Abbott's policies, and Australia is going to be seen as an absolute laggard, as Mr Waxman has said in the last few days.
So, Christine, it's Adrian here in Hong Kong. We've got a situation here where the G20 leaders are responding to what they think is politically palatable, what the population wants. So isn't the issue here that the climate change case, which I think is very credible, you look at the World Bank report, the 4 Degrees report, the scientific data, it's all correct, but we're losing the message. We're not getting it through to the electorate that this is important.
Well, actually, things are turning around in Australia. Recent polling has shown that the community want action taken on climate change, that they would like Australia to lead, and certainly in our case the extreme weather events we've experienced here, from profound drought, the cyclones, the bushfires, people are recognising that there are very significant costs associated with global warming even right now, let alone the longer term. But it's the opportunity cost that people are beginning to realise. If we don't decarbonise our electricity sector, then we're going to miss out on a huge amount of investment, new technology, new jobs in Australia. And that's where I think the Chinese and the Americans clearly get it. And with the Americans and now the Chinese moving on emissions trading and in the European Union, Australia will be going in the wrong direction, and we stand to be a rust bucket economy in the longer term unless we recognise we need to act on climate change and act fast.
We also need to act on the economy and the current so-called budget emergency situation that we have in Australia. You, of course, will be pivotal in getting the budget legislation through the Senate. Have you decided yet what you're going to pass through and what you're not, and what you're going to talk to the government more about in terms of negotiations?
Oh, well, first of all, there is no budget emergency in Australia. We have a government trying to impose an ideological agenda, very much like the Tea Party in the United States. It's all about smashing welfare.
There is a structural problem with the budget that needs to be addressed in order to curtail the deficit that we currently have.
There's certainly a need to raise more revenue. If you want to spend money on services, as the Greens would like to do, and health and education in particular, you have to raise that money. The issue here, though, is the government is not prepared to raise the money from people who can afford to pay. So they won't, for example, get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. That's billions a year going to the big miners. They won't, for example, fix the mining tax, which would return billions to the budget, and they're abolishing carbon pricing, which the big polluters are currently paying in order for us to make the changes. So they're choosing to forego revenue streams and at the same time saying to the unemployed that they have to live for 6 months on nothing, that they're trying to introduce co-payments to undermine universal health care in Australia. So we're not going to stand by and let that happen. So we will vote against those measures, but we have put on the table the revenue raising measures, and this is which really exposes that Tony Abbott isn't serious about transformation of the economy.
All right, we are out of time, but fascinating discussion. Thanks very much for joining us today. That was Christine Milne, the leader of the Greens. Susan, back over to you in Hong Kong.